So I think at the end of the day, like I 100% believe teachers want to keep our students safe. I think we just don't always think about digital safety and physical safety the same way. And so just starting to have those conversations.
Hi there, I am Monica Burns, and welcome to the new Easy EdTech podcast episode. As a former New York City public school teacher and current EdTech consultant, I started this podcast in 2019 to share my favorite classroom tech integration tips and stories from my experiences. Each episode offers practical ideas for you to try, share, or save for later. Be sure to check out classtechtips.com/podcast for today's show notes and resources. And if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or another favorite podcast app, you'll find the show notes link in the description too. This episode is sponsored by my new free ebook on ChatGPT. It's called 60 Plus Must-Try ChatGPT Prompts for Teachers, and it's full of ideas that will save you oodles of time. To grab the free ebook, go to classtechtips.com/chatgptbook. That's my website, classtechtips.com, and add a /chatgptbook. You can also find the link in the description of this episode or by tapping on the free stuff button on my website, classtechtips.com. This week's episode is titled Protecting Student Data, Smart Strategies for Schools and Districts with Roxi Thompson. And I can't wait for you to listen to this important conversation. I first learned about Roxi's work from an article in Edutopia, and I'll link to that in the show notes today. I wanted to ask her a few questions about this topic because it often comes up in conversations that I have around technology integration and ways to keep students safe online. This episode is all about data. So if this is something you've been considering or you've been thinking about, or you are deep in the weeds with developing policy and plans, you're definitely going to want to hear from Roxi. Let's jump into the conversation so you can hear these actionable tips and strategies. Welcome to the podcast. I am so excited to chat with you today about a big topic of student data and safeguarding student data specifically. But before we jump into those questions around data privacy, would love for listeners to learn a little bit about your role in education. What does your day-to-day look like?
Hi, so first of all, thank you so much for having me on. I'm so excited to be here. My name is Roxi Thompson. I am an EdTech coach in a K-8 district in Arizona. Prior to this, I was a classroom teacher for about 8 years, and I work with 2 other coaches. So we have a small but mighty team. Our day-to-day looks like most coaches, very different from week to week, but a large part of our job is to design and lead professional development for all of the staff in our school. So we have several programs that support our new teachers. We often get asked to provide PD for them in the area of integrating technology. We have 33 campuses in our district, so we're constantly asked to design PD based on their school goals or challenges they're seeing. And then sometimes we are asked to provide PD for our classified staff. So in addition to PD, we also provide one-on-one coaching support for teachers that are looking for maybe lesson ideas, or they're exploring digital tools that are in our new curriculum we've adopted, or maybe just trying to address some challenges they're seeing. And then we also work with our IT department on some big projects. One of those is what we're going to be talking about today, which is addressing student data privacy and trying to really get our vetting process in place so that we make sure all the apps we're using are safe for our students.
Yeah, well, I can imagine just, there's a lot of things happening over the course of your day and your week that look different, right? In the ways you're thinking about technology integration. And, when I saw an article that you had written around this idea of data privacy and best practices and tips for educators, I wanted to reach out to chat with you about this topic that I think can feel kind of big and scary or intimidating, right, for people at all levels working with students. Many apps used in schools can potentially compromise student data. We see news reports, right? We might have had experiences in our own settings. Can you give us an overview? What is the current state of student data privacy in schools and districts? What are some of the most pressing concerns?
Yeah, so I hear the same phrase a lot when I talk to people in other districts, and they'll talk about the wild west of applications, just referring to just the huge increase of apps they have seen in their schools since we were in lockdown. So I think some districts were already trying to address this problem prior to lockdown, especially districts that maybe had very strong one-to-one initiatives and were seeing an increase. But I think for the most part, a lot of districts, this wasn't really something on their radar, prior to lockdown. Now, I think we're all in a common place of trying to get a handle on that. So it looks different in every district because we're all in different places. But I think the more we can share ideas about how we can address this and keep children safe, we're all definitely better off. As far as concerns, I think they typically fall in one of like three major areas, right? So the first would be actual harm to a student. So that might be reputational harm because their information got out there. That might be emotional harm. Maybe they're getting bullied because, sensitive information is now in the wrong hands. Or maybe it's like physical harm because their location or, address or tracking is being shared. So I think there's that. There's also concerns about legal compliance. There are, federal, state laws that are related to student data privacy and that provide rules about what districts can and can't share about their student information. And then I think the third would be the concern over just public relations disasters, right? So even if you haven't broken a law per se, it's still really easy to break that trust with your community. And just the idea that maybe families or communities may think that you have behaved in some way that is irresponsible or unethical, it's really hard to reestablish trust once it's gone. So I think the more we can get ahead of that and the more transparent districts can be about what they're doing to protect students, I think everybody wins situation.
That's such a great point too, because I think, when we think of something just maybe like it looks bad, right? Or there's a news report, it's more than just that, right? It really is that trust factor that's being highlighted and making sure that everyone knows what's happening, with all the data that their children, if it's a parent or families that are thinking about, what is going on that they might not feel like they have a good sense of because it's kind of out of reach. And I'm really, glad that you mentioned this difference, if you will, or, this kind of timeline shift of before lockdown and before remote learning, because, I'm sure you've been asked this question a lot too. People, always ask, what are some of the silver linings, which is not my favorite way of phrasing, right, the situation that we've all been in the past several years, and one of the things I've said is, the vocabulary. People are asking better questions about how are we using technology, or, what does digital citizenship look like, or, the privacy piece, which, you don't know what you don't know until you have to tackle some of these challenges. And now everyone, right, in the past few years has tackled them. So, what are some of the most common ways that student data is compromised or put at risk, through the use of different apps or websites in schools?
Yeah, I think when we're talking about apps specifically, there's kind of two main things I think of. There's vendor misuse, right? So if the ed tech company itself is using that information in a way that is irresponsible, inappropriate, possibly breaking some laws, that's one bucket. So things like using that information to target students for marketing, or maybe they're sharing that information with another party without first asking permission from the school or the parent, right? And then maybe they're possibly selling that information to another party. And I think there's sort of a common, like, if something is free, that means you're the product thing that goes around, which I don't mean to say every company that offers a free tool is doing something nefarious.
Right.
I don't believe that. I do think, though, if something is free, you're not being charged to use it. We definitely need to ask some questions about what are they doing with that information? How exactly are they, making money as a company? The other thing I think it would be just app security. So what is that vendor? What is that ed tech company doing to protect your information once you have shared it with them? So are they using best practices? Are they encrypting sensitive information? Are they, periodically doing risk assessments to see if they have any weaknesses? Worst case scenario, if they have a breach, are they going to let you know that as soon as possible so that, you and the families can start preparing and do the work you need to do to, make sure that you do credit checks or whatever that means, for that student over the next, decades of their lives. So I think those are kind of those two main areas that encompass most of the risks with apps.
So in your experience then, are schools and districts generally aware of these risks? Do they have the language to ask questions to a vendor, right? Like how are they addressing this?
Yeah, I think there is a really large divide between the awareness amongst IT leaders
Mhm.
versus the awareness of people at the campus level, like teachers and coaches and principals. And, I was at the FETC conference back in January. It was my first one. It was amazing. I went to a variety of sessions. About half of them were on the EdTech coach track. So for coaches like me, and the other half were the IT leader track, for technology leadership. And every single session on the IT leadership track, it came up: data privacy, data security. Even if that wasn't like the topic of the session, it was always there in the room. People were talking about it. So there was a shared, understanding that this was something we need to be addressing. In my EdTech coach sessions, like it wasn't mentioned one time. And I thought that was really interesting looking back. I think there are a variety of reasons for that. But I do think there is kind of a sense that this is like an IT problem or a district problem. And I think the truth is, if we want to create that culture of, data privacy and safety, it really needs to be everyone working towards
Mhm.
that. And I think as coaches, we're in a very unique position because we have some of that tech, language and that tech know-how, but we're also on the ground with teachers. And often we're the ones that are suggesting tools to teachers. And so I think if we can make it part of our conversations, does this tool align with the learning goals? Does it align with curriculum? And then also, also I made sure to check that it is safe for our students, or I made
Yeah.
sure, it only shares this information, and just start working that into our conversation so that teachers start picking up on that. And then when they go to choose those apps and websites, they're thinking about that in their head, because unless you shut down the internet, which I don't think anyone thinks is a practical response to this, like we need teachers on board because they're making those
Mhm.
choices every day. So we need them to know their risks, but then we also need to give them those tools to make really good, responsible decisions.
Yeah, and just that awareness factor, right? I know I mentioned it before,
Uh-huh.
but like you don't know what you don't know, right? So how do you even ask a question, or how do you even review something or double check with someone that this is a vetted resource for our school community unless you have that context and unless you've had those conversations, together with, your team. So I think that awareness aspect is so important. And, as you were talking about just the different, I love FETC, it's one of my favorite conferences. And so as you were talking about the different tracks of things, right? Like it is something that is part of, all the things that we do, even if, an IT admin, may make certain decisions or do some of the behind the scenes work or things, right? It is something that we can all think about when it comes to making sure student data is secure. So, in your article for Edutopia, which I, will link out to for everyone to see, you mentioned that schools and districts can develop a comprehensive plan to protect student data, right? It doesn't have to be responsive to a situation. It can be very proactive. Can you walk us through the key components of this kind of plan for someone who's listening who might be kind of wrapping their head around what it might need to entail?
Yeah, and I want to say, first of all, this isn't specifically meant to be in this order, right? It
Yeah.
might look different at your campus depending on what you already have in place. But the first step would be to identify a point person. So who is going to be that primary contact that can provide guidance, that can answer questions? That might be someone at the district level, like a technology director, or that might be someone at a school level, like a principal or a coach. Kind of just depends on the size and makeup of your district. The next step is to develop a communication strategy. So really think about how are you going to involve all those different stakeholders in your district. So everyone from, superintendents to classroom teachers to everything in between. Think about your community, right? Or what are you going to share with parents about what you're trying to do to protect their students?
Mhm.
And I think if you are going to go the route of developing a list of apps for teachers, which I think is a good idea, that you really want to start talking about really soon. Because the last thing you want is for a teacher that has used a tool for the last 5 years to all of a sudden go to use it and it's blocked
Mhm.
and they have no idea why, or it's the day before their lesson and they check it and it's blocked. So we really want to make sure that we keep everyone in the loop at all stages of this. And the next step is to identify the websites and apps that are being used currently. That can be really challenging if you're a large district. I've seen people go at this kind of a variety of ways. We started with just kind of our biggest, like district adopted tools, things that we were paying for, and then just ones that we knew just from being in classrooms were pretty heavy hitters. And then you can use other tools to gather that information. So for example, we use GoGuardian in my district to monitor Chromebooks, but it also populates a dashboard that shows you what those, most commonly used apps are. So we also took that information. There are other tools that do similar things out there, and I linked those in the article. And the next step is to develop an understanding of the laws and regulations related to student data privacy. This is complicated, and I will say 2 years ago, I'm not sure I could have written a sentence for Edutopia. We've done a lot of work in our district and tried to educate ourselves. So there is, two I'll mention. One is FERPA, which is the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, and then COPPA, which is the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act. Those are two you're going to really want to know pretty well. And then in addition to that, states have really gotten in the game with trying to come up with their own privacy laws and regulations. So there are places where you can find all of those listed. I will include that in the show notes, a sort of one-stop shop where you can find all the laws for your state. Next, you'll want to vet those apps for compliance and for data privacy. I would not suggest anyone do that alone. Get yourself a team. That might be some IT people, some curriculum people. Maybe there's a principal, some teachers that want to be part of that, so that you get those different perspectives and you have those rich conversations about the tools. You're going to look at a lot of terms of service and privacy policies. It is a little overwhelming at first. I promise it gets easier, and there are tools that can help. So one that we used a lot in the beginning, we're kind of getting going, was the Common Sense evaluation tool, which is free. And they have vetted a pretty large collection of apps. And if nothing else, it starts to give you a sense of the language and the things you're going to want to look for when you're vetting. And then if you decide to go this route, create a list of approved apps for your teachers. So this is a kind of a sensitive one, especially if you're in a district where that has not been a thing. Teachers have not been used to getting things approved. I do think, though, teachers have so much on their plates, and to ask them to look through these terms of service and privacy policies for all these different apps, I don't know that that's practical. So if you can take that off their plates, if you can have someone to do that for them, and a lot of times there's like 4 different apps that do pretty similar things. So even if it's just like, hey, of these 4, here's the one that does the best job protecting our students' information, let's use this one, right? So if you can put that list together and do that work for them, I think we can get teachers on board so that they have a tool for them to help protect their students. I think at the end of the day, like, I 100% believe teachers want to keep our students safe. I think we just don't always think about digital safety and physical safety the same way. And so just starting to have those conversations.
And what you said there is all of these things are just, Roxi, are just so actionable, I think, for educators who are tackling this. And I really appreciate the way you framed the app list, if you will, right? Because we know, right, I've been in the classroom where, if someone came in and said, you can't use X, Y, and Z anymore, and it was such a game changer, right? Like, it would be really hard to stomach that unless you're having those big conversations around the why, and you're having that level of transparency with everyone in the community to say, like, I get it. However, right, this is why we're making these really tough calls, or this is something else that does, the same sort of thing, even if it might not be perfect in all these other ways, it does address this other issue that we've prioritized. So, the way that you brought that up and just emphasize that piece, I think is really useful for listeners who might be hesitant to make that sort of, decision, because it does impact people and their day to day. So, I'm curious if you have any, it might be from your environment, success stories or examples of schools or districts that have implemented effective data privacy measures.
Luckily, there are some districts that are doing amazing things that the rest of us, have some ideas, some models. I will say at the top of the pyramid, there are districts that have earned something called the Trusted Learning Environment, or TLE seal. So this is a program from COSIN. If people aren't familiar with COSIN, it's the Consortium for School Networking, and it's really geared towards supporting EdTech leaders. The TLE program is a privacy framework that was designed specifically for school systems. So for school districts to earn that seal, they have to meet these like really high standards of data privacy. So it's a pretty big deal, but they divide it into these 5 core areas. So even if you're not at that point, at that level, what that program does is give you a really great roadmap for some things you can start doing. But schools that have, or districts that have earned that seal have shown that they're taking measures, like they have very clear policies, right, at the leadership level of what exactly is expected with data privacy. They have a very, clear vetting process. Everyone understands, there's flowcharts that help people along through that process. A lot of them have really great websites to provide that transparency to their community and to their families about what their policies are. Here are the tech tools that we use. Here's the information that is being shared so that there's that trust between them and their families. The PD is a huge part, right? That training for all of the staff. So they have regular training, it's part of all those conversations. And then at the classroom level, that teachers are using that vetting process, but also that teachers are helping to educate our students, right? Because that's the other piece. We want to educate our teachers, but when our students leave our classroom, they hop on their personal devices and they start signing up for all kinds of stuff.
Yeah.
So we really need to make sure that we are giving them the tools and we're giving them the knowledge so that they can make informed, responsible decisions, even when they're not in our classrooms, so that's the other key part. So those districts that have earned that seal are doing amazing work. But even if you aren't quite there yet, there are self-assessments, there are checklists, and I think it really helps districts kind of plan that, both the short-term and long-term goals, like what are things we can do in the next few months? What are things in the next couple of years, just to make sure that you keep moving forward, because this is not something that's going to happen overnight. Districts spend years before they get this. But I think the important part is just to show that you're doing everything you can and you're working towards that. So everyone in the district community, sees that and appreciates that.
Well, this is just such a wonderful conversation, Roxi. I really appreciate you sharing these actionable, action items, right, with listeners, things that they can consider, bring back to their team, these next steps, all of the advice on how to pull these pieces together, be transparent along the way. So really appreciate you carving out the time to share here on the podcast. And I want to make sure, of course, I'll link out so people can find you, but for someone who might be on the go and kind of listening in and not ready to click on links just yet, where can people connect with you? Where can they learn more about your work?
Yeah, so I'm on Twitter a lot. I'm at Roxi_Thompson. And then also in the last year, I've kind of gotten a little more active on LinkedIn. So I'm there at Roxi Thompson also. But I would love to connect with people, whether that is people that are doing really great things and you want to share examples. I would love to see that. I think that's helpful for everyone. Or if you're just getting started and you're kind of looking for more resources or information. So please reach out. I would love to talk.
We'll make sure to put all the links so everyone can find them. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
I'm so excited that I had a chance to chat with Roxi for this episode. Let's finish up by making this EdTech easy with a few key points from this episode. Bring stakeholders together. Create a plan to address student data privacy. Stay transparent as you make and communicate decisions. Remember, you can find the show notes and the full list of resources from this episode, including all the ways to connect with Roxi Thompson, on classtechtips.com/podcast and finding today's episode, number 212. This episode is sponsored by my new free ebook on ChatGPT. It's called 60 Plus Must-Try ChatGPT Prompts for Teachers, and it's full of ideas that will save you oodles of time. To grab the free ebook, go to classtechtips.com/ChatGPT-book. That's my website, classtechtips.com, and add a /ChatGPT-book. You can also find the link in the description of this episode or by tapping on the free stuff button on my website, classtechtips.com. Thanks for joining us for another Tuesday edition of the Easy EdTech podcast. Remember to hit follow on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite app to have next week's episode ready for you on Tuesday morning. Feel free to share takeaways from this episode with friends or colleagues in a quick email or text, or even on social media. And don't hesitate to tag me at Class Tech Tips if you have any questions.